Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first webinar in Women's World Banking's Making Finance Work for Women 2023 webinar series. My name is Yashmin Fernandes, Director of the Women's Digital Financial Inclusion Advocacy Hub at Women's World Banking. Before I dive into today's session, I wanted to share a few key points as we get started. First, please be aware that this event is being recorded. Second, you'll notice everyone's microphones are muted and cameras are off. This is intentional to keep the focus on our speakers today. Third, if you should experience any technical issues, please reach out to the email you should see in your screen, and we will do our best to assist you. Fourth, we will be hosting a Q&A, question and answer session, toward the end of the webinar. To elevate questions to our speakers, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And finally, I'd like to extend a special thank you to our Making Finance Work for Women supporters, leading sponsor, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, advancing sponsor, Ernst & Young, broadening sponsors, European Investment Bank and MetLife Foundation, and supporting sponsors, United Nations Capital Development Fund and Sasakawa Peace Foundation. We are also grateful for the ongoing support of our core funders for enabling our strategy. Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, and Visa Foundation. Today's session on solutions to address the mobile gender gap is especially relevant when we think about digital access on phones as a critical step to serving women well with relevant financial services, especially the low-income women segment in rural areas. Accessing and using financial services via a branch is a luxury that so many women do not have. They might have to travel long distances, which is expensive, and they lose precious time because time away from their business is lost revenue. The travel can be unsafe, and entering the branch can be uncomfortable for many low-income women, especially given restrictive social norms. Digital financial services is a way to bring women into the formal financial system in a way that's secure, private, reliable, and convenient. When designed correctly, that is, in a gender intentional way, and keeping women at the center, it enables us to bring the bank to her and allows her to access and use financial services on her own terms. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Claire Sibthorpe. Claire is head of digital inclusion in the Mobile for Development team at GSMA. She leads the Connected Women and Connected Society programs, which are focused on accelerating digital inclusion for the underserved in low and middle income countries. Claire has been working for over 25 years with public, private, and international development organizations on social policy and service delivery, with a focus on information and communications technology policy and practice. She has developed, managed, and implemented programs in Africa, Asia, and the UK. We are excited to have her provide an overview of the top-line findings from the GSMA's soon-to-be-released 2023 Mobile Gender Gap Report. I'm also happy to report that GSMA is a global member of our coalition for the WDFI Women's Digital Financial Inclusion Advocacy Hub. Please join me in welcoming Claire Sibthorpe to the virtual stage.
Thank you so much, Yasmin, and thank you for having me. I'm just going to share my screen. It's showing and talk you through what our data has. We just released for International Women's Day some of our high-level numbers from on the mobile internet gender gap. And I'm very pleased to share it with you today. We're talking about mobile because mobile is the primary way that most people access the internet, particularly women, and as Yasmin said, access also financial services in many ways. So we collect this data every year to measure, what is the state of play in terms of the mobile internet gap, mobile ownership gap. What are the barriers women facing? How is this changing over time? We do this through nationally representative surveys in order to understand the people who are connected and not connected. And we're very grateful for the support from the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office of the UK government and Swedish CEDA for supporting us to be able to collect this really important data. So I'm going to share where we're at. This is a slide which shows the trend. I think what's kind of the key finding that we shared last week is that for the second year in a row, women's rate of digital inclusion is slowed down. So that's a bit worrying. And I'll just talk you through what this graph says. So you can see that when we started to collect this data in 2017, the mobile internet gender gap, so that's the has been reducing quite significantly from 25% in 2017 to 15% in 2020. But then, unfortunately, in 2021, as this graph highlights, for the first time since we started tracking it, we saw that the gender gap was no longer reducing. And in fact, in some countries, it was increasing. This was as a result of a sort of slowdown in the rate of digital inclusion and adoption of mobile internet by women. But whereas men's rate of adoptions were still, growing. And unfortunately, now we're seeing in 2022 that even though more women are using mobile internet than ever before, so the rates are, number of women using mobile internet continues to increase, but it's the rate of their adoption has further slowed. And for men in last year, their rates of adoption also slowed, which shows that sort of digital inclusion is slowing down overall. So as a result, the gender gap remains unchanged. So now 2 years in a row, we're seeing stalled rates of digital inclusion and also a stalled gender gap in mobile internet. So this is quite a worrying trend and just shows the impact of COVID and all the other economic crises that are happening in the world and how they're disproportionately impacting women and some of the more marginalized. And we're seeing it play out in the digital inclusion. This slide shows, we're now at the gender gap in mobile internet is 19%. So women are 19% less likely than men to use mobile internet. But this number also hides some bigger regional and national disparities. So the gender gaps is biggest in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. So you can see, for example, in South Asia, it's as high as 41% for that region. So I think it's important to also look at the how the gaps vary depending on the region, the country, and within countries. So when we publish our updated gender gap report in May, we'll be sharing the data for each of the regions and the countries where we're collecting this data. The type of phone you own is really important. So obviously you need to have a phone to be able to access the internet, and particularly an internet-enabled phone. And so we also track phone ownership and types of phones. And we see that similar to the gender gap in mobile internet, for the last 2 years, we've seen a stalled reduction in the gender gap in smartphone ownership, with women 17% less likely than men in low and middle income countries to have a smartphone. And I think this is particularly important because when we look at when women do own a smartphone, their awareness of mobile internet and their use of mobile internet is almost on par with men. So also tackling this sort of underlying gender gap in smartphone ownership is critically important if we're also going to drive digital inclusion and ensure that women are able to kind of reap all the benefits from phone ownership. But again, it's stalled for a second year in a row as well. So what does this data show? So, we're seeing 2 years in a row now, stalled rates of digital inclusion, which shows that we just need more action, more focus. I think we need sort of 4 key things. We need to have a focus on gender equality. We need to have set targets to reach women. We need to understand the mobile gender gap without, having this data that I've shared and we'll be sharing more of in May. How do we know what's happening? How do we know where to focus efforts? How do we know what the key barriers are? So we just need more data on this topic. We need to kind of really focus on addressing women's needs and barriers. Every year, we look at what are the key barriers that are stopping women from using mobile internet, and every year the same barriers come out most strongly that the top barriers are affordability, particularly of handsets, and literacy and digital skills, also as a sort of top two barriers. And we see social norms and structural inequalities between men and women playing out, and meaning that these issues disproportionately impact women. But there's other barriers around lack of relevant services, safety and security concerns, challenges around access. But we need to look at addressing all these barriers, and we need to collaborate. And I wanted, having sort of shared some bad news and saying how the gap is really stalled and progress is slowed. We do know that when you do take targeted action, it is possible to make a difference. We have mobile operators who have made formal connected women commitments to reduce the gender gap in their either mobile money or mobile internet customer base. They set targets, and then they do targeted action to try and intentionally reach women. And since 2016, our mobile operator commitment partners have reached over 65 million women. So they are successfully addressing this issue and tackling the gap. So it does show that if we do focus on the issues and take an intentional approach, then we can make a difference. So I think our latest data is a strong call to action that we need to do more. The gender gap's not going to close on its own, and the trend is not positive right now, but we can make a difference. So I would encourage everybody to do that. And again, I just wanted to end with, our report will be available at the end of May, the full report. I've put the link on here to the website. Feel free to contact my team if anybody has any more. And again, just wanted to thank our donors, UK Aid and Swedish SIDA, for allowing us to share this data and do the work that we're doing. So I will stop sharing now and hand back to you, Yashmin, for the discussion.
Thank you so much, Claire. As you noted, please stay with us as we bring on your fellow panelists. We have two fintechs with us today, and both of them, I'm happy to say, are members of the Women's World Banking global network of financial services providers. First, from Ghana, Saqib Nazir is the CEO of People's Pension Trust and a fintech entrepreneur who has extensive experience in developing and implementing solutions aimed at making technology locally relevant and using it to solve everyday problems. The impact of his work in the fintech space earned him the Outstanding Contribution to Ghana's Fintech and Telecom Sector Award at the Ghana Information Technology and Telecom Awards in 2018, as well as the Ghana Fintech CEO of the Year at the Ghana CEO Excellence Awards in 2019. People's Pension Trust is also a winner of our 2021 Fintech Innovation Challenge. From Indonesia, please join me in welcoming Aria Widyanto. Aria is the Director and Chief Risk and Sustainability Officer of Amartha. This financial technology startup focuses its mission on providing affordable financial services and mentorship for women micro-entrepreneurs living in rural areas. Operating as a peer-to-peer lending platform, Amartha has disbursed more than $750 million of working capital to more than 1.5 million borrowers. Aria is also the advocate for the women's empowerment at G20 Empower, representing the Indonesian private sector at the G20. Amartha is a member of our Women's Digital Financial Inclusion Advocacy Hub Coalition in Indonesia. Thanks to everyone for joining me on the virtual stage. I'd like to turn to our newly joined speakers on the stage, Saqib and Aria. Is there anything that surprises you about the data that was just shared by Claire? Aria, why don't you start, and then we'll turn to Saqib.
Thank you, Yashmin. I think it rings a bell and resonates our previous research supported by WWB and Gates Foundations as well back in 2018, where apparently there is a gap between literacy and adoptions of digital and mobile internet between men and women. Even back then, we discovered the term technophobia, where it is exclusively for women, especially in rural areas. Like Claire mentions, in certain regions, apparently the gaps widens. So I'm rather surprised that the gap is still there after a few years, but yeah, we are familiar with the figures.
Thank you, Aria. And Saqib, would love to hear your reactions to what Claire just presented to us.
Thank you. Yes, it's sad and surprising, that there's still such a gap. And secondly, that the gap, after so many years of progress, is further widening again. And I'm just thinking in the back of my head, whether it's COVID, and COVID, of course, have so many implications. And women did bear the brunt of some of the effects of COVID, and it rather encourages us to work hard to make sure that we overcome these effects and accelerate access to internet technology and financial services to women in order to help lift up those segments of society.
Thank you, Saqib. Aria, I wanted to ask you a question because you come from a very unique market. Indonesia is the largest archipelago in the world, with only about 6,000 of its roughly 18,000 islands populated. So it's incredibly dispersed. And I was wondering, given that geography, what is the biggest challenge that you're seeing when it comes to the nexus between mobile internet ownership and women's digital financial inclusion in Indonesia?
Yeah, Indonesia is blessed with geographical marvels where we are, as an archipelago nation, we have 17,000 islands. But also these separations makes the financial inclusions becomes a big challenge. So if you see in Indonesia, the financial inclusions, especially among the rural villagers, are relatively low. However, in the middle of digital transformations, where almost everybody now has internet access, including women in rural areas, this is the first time where we could accelerate the access of finance for the rural communities. With the internet access, apparently geographical challenge is no longer an issue, because you could access various products offered by financial technology providers in Indonesia. So this is the biggest opportunity for us now to accelerate and to reduce the gaps of financial inclusions by piggybacking the development or the progress of digital adoptions, especially among the rural communities, those who are still, let's say, excluded from the financial inclusions when we are using the conventional ways.
And do you have any ideas, and I know Amartha does so much work in the rural areas, around that really end of that last mile, right? I think of Papua or other areas where I know Indonesia has very aggressive financial inclusion targets set by the government, up to 90%, but how do we reach that last 10%?
Right. So those last 10% are including the vulnerable groups, those living in very remote islands, those coming from a very excluded areas, including the barrier of education. Those coming from lower educational background tends to be reluctant to adopt the digital technology and digital financial services. And in this case, we've learned a lot from our experiences, and we come up with the solution where, to address these 10%, those who are still left behind, we need somebody on the ground, somebody who could understand the culture, the behavior of these people. And therefore, these people, we call it like the facilitation agent or the agent banking. These persons are the one who build the trust of this community to the technology, because the barrier to access digital financial services is not only about infrastructures, but also about the reluctance or the fear from this 10% people to adopt the technology. So we need somebody who could build the trust, and therefore sustainably could transform these communities into the digital society.
Thank you, Aria. And I'm so glad you brought up the concept of the agent facilitators on the ground. At Women's World Banking, we've seen in our research and our work that moving customers, especially low-income women, from analog to digital, it's not an overnight thing, and it does take time to build up trust. We found that agent banking is a key stepping stone to reaching digital financial inclusion. And in India, they're called business correspondents. We see them in Nigeria and Mexico, and they really have a key role in these communities because they have already built relationships with the women. So they're more likely to go to them, and they're a trusted figure in the communities. So thank you. Claire, you mentioned literacy as a prevalent barrier in your presentation. Excuse me. And Saqib, I wanted to know what has been the approach of People's Pension Trust in addressing literacy amongst your customer segments, especially in the more rural segments.
Thank you, Yashmin. We've made, as much as we are a financial services provider, and we're also heavily dependent on technology, and so we are a fintech, but our core ambition is economic empowerment. And so one of our ambitions is also to lift people out of poverty today through education. So as much as we are there providing pensions, savings, insurance, lending, we also made a core pillar of our company to facilitate education. And that includes financial literacy, digital skills, entrepreneurship training, health and well-being, because we feel that if we could help our customers earn more, their lives are better immediately, and of course, then they're saving with us a bit more. And that also helps us achieve our financial targets a bit faster and sooner. So literacy is a core part of our offer today. And of course, we operate in an environment, we look at the data where, again, we're in a highly segmented environment where, there are people who have smartphones, and there are people who have feature phones, and there are people who have no phones. There are people who have internet, and, so it's a very fast-changing environment. And in Ghana already, 60% of the population is urban, right? So it leaves us very specific, and of course, we don't want to leave anyone behind. So we are working heavily, as much as we're investing in the future on smart apps and on internet-based applications, we are not leaving behind the traditional methods of USSD, which is available on feature phone, and also on voice. We're even trying to facilitate voice transactions. So we are looking carefully at the segment. We are trying to make sure that we don't leave anyone behind, and we want to try and offer the full spectrum of services and embed education and literacy into it. The other thing for us is scale, and as much as we're also leveraging agents, right, and we are utilizing also groups. So luckily we see that lots of our customers organize themselves in groups, whether it's groups around communities or groups around their economic activities, whether it's fishermen or farmers or hairdressers, so that makes it easier to engage with them, to provide the necessary literacy and training, but we are really looking at scale, and we are experimenting a lot on how we could, distribute literacy digitally at scale, which is, I think, the only way to do it, luckily for us today, is through technology and through mobile service. So we are lucky that in Ghana, as much as internet penetration and the gap might be there, we are lucky that today Ghana has mobile phone penetration of about 130%, right? Which is, one of the most advanced in the region. And there is generally good internet service on most areas, and so we are leveraging as much as possible to try and roll out and embed literacy and education into our services. We are experimenting with things such as gamification, biting it down into small sizes, and then, of course, using data analytics in order not to just bombard everybody with the same messages, trying to build specific messages, or specific courses that are specific to the data that we have on those unique customers.
Thank you. That's so helpful, Saqib. And where Aria spoke about the agent facilitators as a key way. I loved how you talked about the literacy, but also literacy at scale, because I know that one of the challenges is that traditional financial literacy and digital literacy has not been it's not always the most cost effective, not easily leads to scale. And so it's great to hear how you're looking at how do you address that education challenge at scale, because that's really important as you're reaching the last mile of participants. Claire, I wanted to turn to you for a minute. And given that the GSMA represents the interests of mobile operators worldwide, uniting nearly, I believe it's 800 operators with more than 250 companies in the broader mobile ecosystem, including handsets and device makers, software companies, equipment providers, and internet companies. What are you hearing from mobile network operators? And how are partnerships important to addressing the mobile gender gap at scale?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So yeah, I mean, what I'm excited about is the fact that the mobile industry has really prioritized this issue, for example, through the Connect to Women Commitment Initiative. I mean, they're just leading the way and driving, accelerating digital and financial inclusion for women. I really think, key is that kind of that setting those bold targets and then working on it. But this can't be done by the mobile industry alone. I mentioned that the top barriers are things like affordability, basic literacy, digital skills, things like that. And so they need other partners to get involved. And I sort of didn't mention in my opening remarks, but we're also seeing that in the last year, in 2022, women were, not only was the gender gap stalled, but they were more likely to report sort of decreasing the amount of the internet they use compared to men, particularly rural women and particularly less educated, which again shows, I think, that some of these economic crises, which is, I think the gap is reducing. It's not reducing because, it's becoming, handsets and things are becoming much less affordable, income's going down, there's all these systemic issues. So they need partnerships, they need, we need, governments to get involved, have a role to play around improving literacy and skills, as well as helping improve affordability by doing things like reducing, taxation, unnecessary taxation and things like that. We also need partnerships with, NGOs who work in some of these areas who have access to these women and these networks and are trusted people who can, especially in countries where there's strong social norms, to kind of where there might be some concerns about women going and out and to predominantly male environments to access. So using some of these other networks that are available to help reach some of these women. And as you said, the things like handset distributors and makers, we see our members doing a lot of partnerships around sort of device financing, partnering with different players around how they can help get access to some of these devices for women who don't have assets or a big credit history, doing sort of small repayments using technology like remote locking of phones as a way of guaranteeing and reducing risk, but they're doing a lot of these in partnerships with others to kind of get these devices out. So I think partnership is key. It needs, all these stakeholders to get involved. There's no one stakeholder that can address this gap. The reasons for the gap are multiple, complex, and kind of require intervention and support by everybody working together. So I think absolutely partnership is key.
Yeah, can I just dig a little deeper, just one aspect of the partnership?
Sure.
You mentioned all the different players. What role does the government or policymakers play in this space? And I know that GSMA does a lot of work in this area. Or just any top line thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think government has a key role to play. I mean, from everything from sort of the enabling environment, like around improving literacy and digital skills, and as I said, make it more affordable, but also driving relevant services, sort of e-government and other kind of government services that can help, ensure that these mobile is relevant and is acceptable for women to be using. So I think there's a whole range of ways. In fact, I'll put in the chat, but we published a report just last September with outlining what we think are the key kind of government policy recommendations for what governments can do to really move the needle on this. I think even just prioritizing gender is really important. It would be great if more governments also just kind of had gender intentional, as you mentioned at the beginning, every organization has to have a gender intentional approach. Private sector, NGOs, also government, we need to have a gender intentional lens. I think the data shows that if we don't have that gender intentionality, this issue is not going to be addressed. So I think having bold targets and then sort of addressing some of these barriers and providing that enabling environment is really critical. So I think government has a very key role to play in this place.
Thank you, Claire. And I love to hear you talk about the importance of gender intentionality, because we in our work, we've seen that it really needs to be at the forefront, whether you're making policy, designing financial services, looking at the channels to reach women. You really need to have women at the center when you're designing that. Thank you. I wanted to pause for a minute and actually give today's attendees a little bit of context. In July of 2022, Women's World Banking and the United Nations Capital Development Fund, otherwise known as UNCDF, launched the Women's Digital Financial Inclusion Advocacy Hub with the support of the Gates Foundation. The Advocacy Hub is an engine to catalyze collective action to increase women's digital financial inclusion globally. It's a collective of global, regional, and local partners that aims to close the gender gap in access to technology, access to skills, and access to digital financial services for women-owned MSMEs, small and medium enterprises in emerging markets. So we have a global coalition comprised mainly of global and regional members. GSMA is a member, as I mentioned earlier, but also two coalitions that we're testing out to see what's the right way to construct these in demonstration markets. And those are initially Indonesia and Ethiopia. So these coalitions in the two countries are made up of civil society, public and private sector organizations, and all of them advocating for women's digital financial inclusion in their markets. Amartha joined the Indonesia coalition of the Women's Digital Financial Inclusion Advocacy Hub last year. And so, Aria, I wanted to ask you from your perspective, not only as a hub coalition member, but also from the financial services provider side, how can partnerships be created to build momentum?
Right. So I think if you are talking about gender gap, it's an multidimensional elements involved in it, and therefore we could not solve the gender gap issues from one angle only, let's say from the financial access only. So I think in the era of digital transformations, there are many things that we could do together to attack this multidimensional problems. For example, like Claire just mentioned, government plays as a catalyst, as a moderator of multiple stakeholders in the market. Let's say through setting up a policy. What we see in Indonesia is like the government is trying to facilitate or broker more financial services to channel their funds through to women or small medium enterprises who are owned or led by women, and there are some incentives in it. So I think this sort of like a policy can be taken as an incentives for many financial services provider to enter into that market, because there are many stakeholders involved, let's say from the point of view of literacy training, entrepreneurship trainings, government, and also NGOs organized by the government will also be mobilized, so that the financial services providers could provide a product as an additional services, because there are some other people doing the trainings, doing the education for the customers. So this kind of collaborations will make the financial inclusions becomes high quality. We're not talking about just the numbers of clients or women clients receiving the loans or financial services, but the quality itself will be increased because many people will work together to educate, to promote digital literacy, to use the financial services in a safe way that will make this whole transformations more sustainable.
Thank you, Aria. And just building, because we heard from Claire and Aria on partnerships, Saqib, I just turn to you and ask, what types of partnerships is People's Pension Trust operating within in your country, in Ghana?
Thank you. I think we've discussed it before, that one of the big issues in rolling out services is trust. And trust takes a lot of time and a lot of money to build. And organizations have been on the ground for 10 years sometimes, and we don't have that time. As fintechs, as companies looking to scale and have impact, we need to, of course, reach out much faster. And so this is where we have leveraged partnerships by building products directly with telcos, with banks, with community-based organizations, and many other associations and unions to reach out to their members. So once we have, you could even say sometimes we built white label products. Of course, we are the company that is licensed to provide pensions, so we manage everything. But once, a trusted brand, whether it's a bank or again a telco or some community organization presents you as an in-house product or as a recommended product, then it's much easier to get the buy-in from customers. And we've seen uptake really then ramp up. So that's very important for us to overcome that barrier of having to build that trust and relationship. Partnerships have been incredible for us. And it's win-win for everyone. We're not the only ones who benefit out of this. The organization gets to add value-added services to their portfolio. Their members are happier with them because they see their organization looking out for them and their interests. And sometimes they get to earn a little bit of revenue from us, which they can use to further enhance their services for membership. So I think partnerships are a great way for everyone to move forward. As long as, of course, you have to be careful, of course, you don't compete, but if you can partner and provide complementary services, it's very much possible to overcome the big issue of the cost of customer acquisition, and potentially share value and share services. So I really recommend everyone to explore how they could build partnerships into their product offerings and into their go-to-market strategy.
That's great. It's really helpful. Thank you. As a financial inclusion community, we often talk about relevancy through the lens of an actual product offering. So when it comes to actual mobile phone ownership and addressing the gender gap here, how does relevancy come into play? Saqib, I wanted to look at your region. In sub-Saharan Africa, women are 30% less likely to own a smartphone than men. How has People's Pension Trust been able to make the case to your women customers to engage with your digitally driven pension products, especially when mobile internet affordability is a primary concern, and sometimes customers might more easily think about loans or savings before they think about pensions, right? So, and the next following question would be like, what role does data have to play here?
Nice, thank you. So I think first, let me answer the second question first, and that, yes, everybody is looking out for loans, and credit, and unsecured credit is a huge potential in our part of the world, and because everything is primarily based on cash, so you can imagine, that buying a tractor or setting up, a shop is all cash based and there's no credit. But luckily enough, we find that there is a huge demand in the market for pensions. People know what's going on. People appreciate what pensions will do. And there's also traditionally been a big savings culture, whether it's around the concept of SUSU, or community savings group. People are very much aware. We've realized that the big challenge is not getting people to sign up. The big challenge is retention, is how do you keep people signing up sometimes when things go wrong? When things are tight and they have to drop off, how do you keep them engaged? How do you keep them excited? So that's the big challenge that we are dealing with. Yes, on getting customers to sign up digitally is a challenge that we are currently addressing, right? Again, for scale. But then on the aspect of it, so this is where we're looking at building a community and having a whole different model around customer retention. And, again, technology and again, education is a huge component in making sure that customers are satisfied and we understand their needs and demands and can give them products that they're looking for. So that's one aspect which we are working with, and we're making amazing progress. The second aspect of data, yes, it's a huge challenge, and this is where USSD has been a great tool for us. Luckily, mobile money has paved the path for us. Ghana has almost 100% coverage of mobile money. We have in excess of 14 million mobile money accounts, which is equal to the adult population of the country. Yeah, some of these statistics, of course, when you get on the ground, you realize that they're very skewed towards urban and towards the higher elements of society. But still, it's a good indicator, and slowly, so mobile money has created, which is heavily USSD based, has created a great skill set, if you can say it as such, to enable people to sign up and understand. And that's what we have carried off first into our product offering. Of course, we realize that USSD is highly limited, right? It is not very robust. It does crash. It doesn't give the best customer experience, but it works, and it's highly acceptable. So that's what we're working on. Keeping in mind future growth, we are heavily investing in apps, right, and in data analytics. Okay, and that's what we think will pay off in the future. So it's a balance we're having to keep, between leveraging people with the skill set to deal with. Do they have a mobile phone? Do they have? And even when people have mobile phones, they don't necessarily have internet, right? Or cannot afford internet. We see many people who have smartphones, but do not have internet switched on. So it's not only having the smartphone, and again, I think Claire spoke about, leasing of phones. That's another aspect we're partnering with those financiers into asset financing to embed products directly onto the phones, so that it gives a great customer experience. And we're having to deal with, again, as I said, many segments of society: people, rural, urban, many age segments, many educational segments, many different experience segments, as well as income segments. There are people like you and me sitting all over the world on smartphones with credit cards, and then there's a farmer in a very poor part of Ghana with maybe no phone. And what we are trying to understand is, how do we reach out to all of these segments of society without diluting ourselves and keeping focus? So it's a challenge we're all working on. We appreciate it, and we're hoping that as we scale up and we have better data on our customers, we'll be able to use that data to build specific and unique products that suit their needs.
Thank you so much, Saqib. We are coming very close to the end of our session today, and so I wanted to ask one last question to all of our panelists. I'll start with Claire, and then Aria, and then Saqib. If you had a magic wand, what would be the one thing you would tell everyone on this call to do now to address the mobile gender gap in an effort to increase women's digital financial inclusion? So Claire, pick up your magic wand. What would you ask our attendees to do, please?
Yeah, I think if everybody in their organization could set a target, have an organizational target to address this issue, that they're then to have held to and take action, I think that'll make a big difference. If we measure it and are held accountable to it, then we will make a difference. So let's all set targets and make this a priority.
Perfect. And can I add on to that target setting? Make sure you are addressing also gender targets as well.
When I meant target was gender targets. When I said targets for addressing gender equality, sorry, I thought it was implicit that I mean gender targets.
Love it.
Targets for gender equality around access. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Claire. Aria, what does your magic wand say?
Yeah, I'll use the magic to make everyone here to create a product design that suits the needs of women, because apparently one of the barrier of the inclusion for women is that the product design itself is not really intuitive for women. But if we are able to design products, whatever product, financial product, digital products, has a intuitive for women, then we could reduce the gap even faster.
That's great. Women-centered design. I love it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Finally, Saqib, what would your magic wand tell us to do?
I don't know if it's relevant. I don't know how the audience could help, but my magic wand would be to ask government and regulators to really reduce the cost, and help facilitate provision of telephone and internet services. I don't want to do Claire's job for her, but the data does show that telephone sales and internet has a huge impact on economies and lifting up people's lives. So I would like to encourage governments to see these services as critical services rather than as income or tax generating services.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Saqib. So thank you to all of the panelists for your contribution to today's discussion and sharing your firsthand experiences. At this point, I'd like to welcome my colleague Lele Balde, who's the program manager for the WDFI, the Women's Digital Financial Inclusion Advocacy Hub, as she'll lead the question and answer discussion.
Thank you very much, Yashmin. I must say it's been a really excellent discussion and the chat has been very lively. We have participants from all over the world. The first question that we have here is for all the speakers. What are the speakers' views on using development funds to simply give out phones to women? Sounds almost silly, but it could be effective if you say smartphone usage capability is generally equal. And this question is from Hugh Lin from a Thurisk insurtech company based in Germany. So that's the first question for the panelists.
Shall we keep it the same order, Claire, Aria, Saqib?
Yeah. Sure. So absolutely, I think, if we can get phones in the hands of women in whatever way, whether it's sort of like financing schemes or subsidy schemes, I think one of the considerations, though, that with that is that in some countries, a challenge can be that if the phones are given out, but then they are sort of used by the men in the family, so they don't stay in the hands of the women. So I think, I think it's great if we can find ways to get phones out, and even I guess if it gets into hands of men, it's still driving digital inclusion, and maybe the women will be able to use it. But I think there are some considerations around, how do we ensure that they stay in the hands of the intended beneficiaries. So I think, but I think it's a great idea if we can get more phones out, but let's also just make sure we're measuring and evaluating these initiatives to make sure they're reaching the right people.
Thank you very much, Claire.
To add on Claire's point, I think in Indonesia's case, 8 out of 10 people owns mobile internet, but only 3 out of 10 people use them for productive purposes and for accessing like digital financial services. So in this case, when those women own cell phones, it doesn't solve the entire problems, because we still have to deal with the literacy, we still have to deal with the availability of the product itself, and also in some areas the internet credit is still considered expensive, and therefore even though they do have a smartphone, but they only occasionally turn it on to access some important news or messenger. But yes, owning a smartphone is a good start, but there is still a long way to go to make it productive.
Thank you so much, Aria. While I have you on the line, there's another question for you here. What are some?
I just want to give Saqib a chance to answer if he wanted to.
Oh, perfect. Perfect.
Thank you. I'll just add that I think, luckily we're in an environment now where we have data, where we have information, and so, we can make smarter decisions, and perhaps we can look at specific segments and provide them with the specific assistance that they may need. Today, that's the kind of environment we operate in, and perhaps that may be a smarter approach than just blanket actions of handouts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saqib. Thank you, Yashmin. So I have a question here for Aria. What are some of the key issues with financial services that product design would solve for women?
It has to start with in-depth research on understanding the behavior of the women. There is no one solution fits for all. all. So even in Indonesia's case, each regions, each provinces has its own cultural backgrounds and also behavior. So to be able to design a good product like women-centered products, especially digital products, you really need to invest time and efforts in understanding the customers that you're going to serve. And in this case, the roles of like product researchers, anthropologists, or somebody who could understand and translate the needs and the requirements gathered from your potential customers into a good product design is very critical, because you're not only designing a product, but you need to make sure that your product is impactful, your product is adopted sustainably, not just being downloaded because there is an incentives or let's say cashback or whatever promotions. But you really need to make sure that the solutions, the product that you launch really address the issues, and therefore make it beneficial for the women and for the entire communities.
Thank you, Aria, for that response on gender-centered design. We have a question here for Saqib and for Claire. So most people across Africa own a basic phone versus a smartphone. So for Saqib, this is for you. As a fintech, is it more important to tailor your offerings to meet the customer where they are, assuming they're connected to the internet, having a text-based service and an app? And for Claire, what's the benefit for low-income customers of smartphone ownership versus basic phones? Great questions.
Thank you so much. I think for us, the approach we've taken is multi-channel and multi-payment, right? We want to facilitate and make it convenient and easy for customers to interact with us, whichever way they think is best. So yes, we have USSD, we have smartphones, we're looking at chatbots on WhatsApp, we're looking even at IVR, right? And then of course we have agents. So we are trying to be as broad as possible in whichever way. Of course, we think that internet and smartphones will give us the scale, in the future that nothing else has been able to give us so far. So that's where we're investing heavily for the future. But at the same time, we don't want to leave anyone behind, and we're investing in all other channels at this time.
Yeah, I'll pick up on the question for me. So, I mean, we do, when we do our surveys, we ask, what is the benefits of phone ownership? And there's, regardless of the type of phone a woman owns, they report significant benefits in terms of accessing information they couldn't have accessed otherwise, feeling safer, various things. But I think the challenge is that we do need to get women up into smartphones. So usually often they might start with a smart feature phone, but eventually a smartphone, because if you just have a basic phone, then they're not able to access the internet. They're missing out on lots of the benefits that they could have. So I think that women need to have equal access to smartphones the same as men. I think, if they don't, then they're not online. And that's a problem. So I think we do, yes, phone ownership is good, but we do need to move men, I think men and women up so that they're able to access the internet, not just basic voice services. We're in an increasingly connected world. And I think in COVID, we just saw how critical the internet was. And so we just need to ensure that people who often would benefit the most from internet access, accessing to health services, education services that they don't have access to in some of these areas, we need to provide, and allow them to have the tools to get some access to some of these services. So we do need to kind of continue to move men and women along that journey to getting from a basic phone to getting online.
Thank you very much, Claire. And the chat is very exciting here. Unfortunately, we can't answer all the questions. This will be the last question from Danielle Hopkins. Her question is, how can we collaborate more with e-commerce platforms to provide access to technology, markets, and digital financial literacy? And Danielle Hopkins works with the UNCDF team in Bangladesh and Nepal. Thank you. That's for all participants.
I can go quickly first. I think for us, we realized that our services are in demand across the whole spectrum of society. It's not just targeting the very bottom of the pyramid. And so we see a huge growth in the gig economy and in e-commerce. And so we are trying to embed our products in partnership with e-commerce providers, not only to customers, but to merchants, to help them create that savings mechanism and record keeping. So again, the whole discussion around partnership is very important to reach multiple segments, which you cannot do on your own. So that's a very interesting segment for the future also for us.
And
Aria, it'd be great to hear from you. Yeah.
yes, so as a fintech, I think that's the role of us as the embedded finance collaborator for e-commerce. For example, e-commerce doesn't have financial products, right? But those who purchase their products from the e-commerce could use our, let's say, short-term loans so that they could, purchase more from this e-commerce, and vice versa. We could, provide a working capital loan for those who wants to improve or scale up their businesses that will be marketed through the e-commerce platform. So in this case, both fintech and e-commerce could work together to provide an end-to-end ecosystems that will eventually benefit our customers and stimulate the productions and the consumption higher.
Great, thank you so much, Aria. Claire, I'd love to hear from you on this.
I'm not sure I have anything more to add than has already been said on this particular point. Yeah.
That's great. And I actually see, we're right almost at time. We've got about 5 minutes left. And so thank you, Lele, for moderating the Q&A, and thank you to all of the panelists. I thought I'd just maybe give a quick recap. I was furiously taking down notes, so I'm sorry if I was looking down at times. I was listening, taking down notes of kind of some of the learnings that I heard, and I want to just give a quick recap. What I heard is, after having seen a reduction of the mobile gender gap for several years, we are now seeing over the past 2 years that the gap is now increasing. I think Claire had mentioned this is probably impact of COVID and the long-term pandemic, as well as economic slowdown. So this is a challenge we all need to be aware of and address the underlying barriers. For example, women, once they do own a smartphone, they find that they have similar usage rates to men, right? So how do we get the smartphones and phones in the hands of women? What I heard also was the need to build trust. So either via agents who are on the ground and are trusted members of the community, or via trusted partners. We talked a lot about building partnerships, using a multi-organizational approach to serving customers, and collaborating with partners who can not only help us reach greater scale, but also do it faster. That partnership model needs to include not just the private sector and civil society organizations, but also the government and regulators, because the government can create a positive enabling environment, drive relevant services, help decrease costs of underlying technology and access to phone, and then also serve as a catalyst. We also heard about the importance of education, so that's financial and digital literacy, and doing so in ways that enable women to absorb content in smaller segments and in innovative ways. So I love the idea of gamification that Saqib had mentioned. I think it's a wonderful way of bringing content to women. And finally, we think about the challenge, it's not just acquisition of customers, but also retention. And we've seen in some markets that access to financial services is not as big of an issue, but you'll see that there's very high dormancy rate. And so you need to make sure that there are great use cases, relevant products and services, and you're engaging with your customer constantly in a way that supports them and also meets your business needs. And finally, my favorite, the magic wand, the 3 things that we heard was, to set a gender intentional target, right? So you can measure your progress and know what else you need to do. I also heard from Aria saying that product design needs to meet women's needs. So we talk about women's role banking, women-centered design in the product and in the channel and how you reach them. And then finally, Saqib, his magic wand would give us government regulators to reduce the cost of telephone and internet services, right? So these are the underlying critical factors that need to be in place in order for us to be able to reach women with digital financial services. So thank you all of you who have attended this webinar. It was wonderful to have you. I feel like we were all in a virtual room together. It was great seeing the chat on the right side of my screen. We appreciated your participation and for submitting questions. And to all of you who are furthering women's digital financial inclusion in your own way in so many markets. Conversations like today's are crucial to sharing knowledge and driving progress for women's financial inclusion. We hope you'll consider joining us at our Making Finance Work for Women Global Summit, which will be May 24th and 25th in Mumbai, in India, where we'll gather with 300 financial inclusion leaders to fuel innovation and the pace of progress for women's financial prosperity, security, and dignity everywhere. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.